Let us hear a word of good news from the Gospel of Mark. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep awake 1 hour? Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And once more he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to say to him. He came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Enough! The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And this is the word of our Lord. So it is my understanding that as you are journeying through Lent, you've been tackling some pretty heavy topics, like fear, anxiety, self-doubt, and insecurity. Talking about that kind of stuff could easily bring down the mood in the house of God and overshadow this brightly lit sanctuary, decked out in festive colors, and blot it all out in black. Talking about these issues isn't meant to bring everyone down, but it is part of our preparation for Good Friday. It's part of our journey to the cross with Jesus, who suffered and died upon a broken tree, bleeding, broken, humiliated, all for us. The crucifixion was a horrifying event, and it showcased how low humans could sink morally and spiritually. It was during the crucifixion that Jesus experienced his most human moment with us, when he cried out in pain, feeling completely betrayed by humanity, and his heart stopped beating. So to fully experience the joy of resurrection on Easter Sunday, we first have to understand this time of Lent. It's a time when we pay special attention to the trials and the temptations of life. It's a time for us to evaluate what suffering really means and try to find God in the midst of it. And it's important to talk about these heavy topics because they are part of our human experience. They are our crosses to bear, and sometimes the crosses that we help others carry. We were created to feel emotions, to think, and to love. It doesn't do us any good to ever deny our feelings or to swallow and suppress them. If we do that, we're in danger of falling into something like depression, which is what I'd like to talk about today. And for our purposes, I'm not speaking strictly of clinically diagnosed depression, but rather a deep state of grief that one feels in mind, body, and in soul. So let's begin here. Jesus was a flesh and blood human being, and everything that we've ever felt, he felt it all. In the 10 verses alone that we just read, we watch him cycle through distress, agitation, grief, fear, and even anger. And in the Gospel of Luke, when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, the text says, in his anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground. The man was awaiting his own death, which he knew was not going to be pretty. He knew it was one of his friends who had betrayed him to this death. I can't even imagine how deep his grief must have been to sweat tears of blood. And of course, we're never told that Jesus has depression. The word isn't used anywhere in the Bible because it simply didn't exist then. But it's often referenced by similar words such as downcast, brokenhearted, troubled, miserable, despairing, and mourning, among others. Jesus wasn't the only person in the Bible to experience deep feelings of grief. Throughout the Word, there are a number of stories about men and women of faith who struggled and battled through dark times of hopelessness and depression. Here are just some of those examples. We have David, who was troubled and battled deep despair all the time. In many of the Psalms, he writes about his own personal weaknesses, of his anguish, his loneliness, his fear of the enemy, his heart cry over sin, and the guilt that he struggled with because of it. Jonah was angry and wanted nothing to do but run away. And after God called Jonah to go to Nineveh to preach to the people there, he fled as far away as he possibly could. And after a storm at sea, he was swallowed by a giant fish, and then he was saved and given a second chance by God, and he obeyed. He preached God's message to the people of Nineveh, and God's mercy reached out to all the people who turned to him. But instead of rejoicing over this, Jonah got mad because God made him look like a fool, in his words. Job suffered through great loss, devastation, and physical illness. This righteous man of God who refused to curse God's name lost literally everything, including his family. Moses was grieved over the sin of his people, and in his feelings of anger and betrayal by his own people, he came down the mountain and was ready to quit. He came down from that mountaintop experience with God's commandments in hand, only to find the Israelites in complete chaos and sin, worshiping a golden calf. Jeremiah, the prophet, wrestled with great loneliness, feelings of defeat and insecurity. He's also known as the weeping prophet, and he suffered from constant rejection by the people he loved and reached out to. God had called him to preach, yet had forbidden Jeremiah to marry or have children. So Jeremiah lived alone. He ministered alone. He was poor, ridiculed, and rejected. And in the midst of it all, he displayed great spiritual faith and strength. And yet we also see his honesty as he wrestled with despair and a great sense of failure. And finally, let's not forget Mary Magdalene. She suffered from the malady of periodic insanity, being possessed by 7 demons. 7 is this mystic number suggesting completeness in the Bible. You see it over and over again. And this implied that the spirits that dominated Mary were extremely severe, like the worst you could possibly get. And she ended up being one of the most dedicated disciples of Christ. So one thing that each of these people had in common, including Jesus in the garden, was that God was with them. God didn't leave them in their despondency and sometimes outright railing against the divine in anger. We learn from the scriptures that no one is perfect and that it's okay not to be okay all of the time. Jesus wasn't always okay. The prophets and the disciples weren't always okay. And that was okay with God, as long as they faced their fears and found a way to move forward with the work that they were called to do. God did not allow people to mope and drown in self-pity for long. And in the experience of those in the Bible, God doesn't tell us that we can't mourn, but instead shows us how not to mourn. The church should be a place where we should feel safe and free to experience all of our emotions, happy, sad, and everything in between. It breaks my heart when people tell me that they've shared their struggles with others at church, only to be told that they were suffering because their faith wasn't strong enough. If that has ever happened to you, I am so sorry. That is so incredibly unfair and so false. You should have been told that there is still a place for you in God and a place for you in the church, right where you are. Not be punished for what you're feeling. So there is no one-size-fits-all treatment for depression or for grief. Modern medicine and psychotherapy have proven immensely helpful when used to treat people with depression, but it has been my experience that even one or both of those is not enough. So for those of you who don't know, I actually have been diagnosed with bipolar II disorder. I was diagnosed in 2009. For those of you who don't know much about it, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, bipolar disorder is a little bit different from depression, but someone with bipolar disorder experiences episodes of extremely low moods that meet the criteria for major depression. But a person with bipolar disorder also experiences extreme highs at some times, called mania. People with bipolar II disorder experience less manic episodes and more depressive ones. When I was first diagnosed in 2009, I was only taking medication, and that didn't help me. I was still massively depressed, and I often isolated myself. So then I started talking to a therapist, and that helped. But something was definitely missing. Something to live for. Something that made me want to get up out of bed every morning, to get dressed, and to go out into the world and make something of my life. Something to serve. And I found that thing I was missing after a friend of mine who saw how much I was struggling invited me to go to church with him. And it was an American Baptist church in the college town that I was living in. And the sermon was exactly what I needed to hear that morning, preached on issues of social justice, making the church relevant to the rest of the world. And the pastor there, Pastor Robinson, was just the type of mentor that I needed in my life. He was understanding, kind, non-judgmental, and he listened to me. Most of the time when we're caring for others who are in pain or experiencing anxiety or depression, they just want us to listen. Pastor Robinson didn't try to fix me or give me unsolicited advice on how to fix my life. He didn't tell me that if I prayed hard enough, that I would be cured. He didn't tell me that being bipolar was some kind of punishment for not having enough faith. No. He assured me that there is really no such thing as normal, and that Jesus loved me just the way that I am, right where I was in life. Christ would be with me in my struggles, and I could draw strength and hope from his promises. And now I stand in front of you, urging you to accept that it is your divine right to have that very same thing. For me, my treatment wasn't complete until it was holistic, encompassing mind, body, and spirit. When I believed Christ's promise that there is always hope for us, even in the darkest of times, I started getting better. His promises are what sustains me in times of struggle. They have been promised to us by the one who does not break promises. Jesus tells us in the Gospel of Matthew, "And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." He sealed this promise in blood, and come hell or high water, it cannot be taken away from us. There is so much more I wish we could talk about on this subject, but this issue is so important, but we only have so much time. So I will end with this. Fear, anxiety, self-doubt, insecurity, and depression will most likely strike all of us sometime in our life. And if not us, it will strike someone that we love. And when we encounter these demons, it's important to be kind to ourselves and kind to others who might be experiencing them. We can't save other people, and other people can't save us. Only God can do that. But we can be emotional and spiritual lifelines in times of danger. We can help. We can extend a hand, an embrace, or a listening ear. We can believe in our own hearts as well as remind our family and friends that it's okay not to be okay. It doesn't mean that God doesn't love them. It doesn't mean God doesn't love you. I hope you believe me when I say this. And if you don't believe my humble mumblings up here, maybe you can believe in the words written by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God. He gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So if things are hard for you right now, please don't give up. If things are hard for someone you know, try to stay faithful to them for as long as it's safe for both of you. Lent is almost over. A new day is coming, and resurrection is near, and it's a chance to start anew. It's a chance to renew your faith and belief and find your truth in God. You are not alone. God is with you. I'm with you. And so are all of these good people seated around you. And I think that that is unbelievably good news.